Okay, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg.
You.
I am super excited, folks. I'm super excited because it's Guy Sengstock, who is the most overdue guest. You are now the most overdue guest that I needed to have.
Most overdue.
Most overdue, because I've been so looking forward to having you on the program. And of course, we've been chatting, but a lot of things intersected to make it not happen. But here we are. Welcome, friend.
Why, thank you, sir. It's good to see you.
Really good to see you.
I've been tracking you a lot, just through our conversations, but also just the work that the series that you keep doing with John and different people and Chris and so forth. So I've been in some sense watching you. I think watching a couple of things, watching your mind with the topic. And what that means is also watching your system, right? And running things through your system, and then it seems like when you run something through the system, it updates the system.
Yep.
Right. Which is just, it's interesting. It's quite a system you got here.
I deeply appreciate
system,
that.
Right?
Hey, man. So in terms of this, I love that you picked that up. So I think the system, hold on, turn this up. The system has this capacity to assimilate, integrate, and then grow in different areas. And so, yeah, that's my feeling really ever since I stumbled on the tree of knowledge. It's like this capacity to pull and network and then grow, it's a garden and all this other stuff. So and then it interfaces like the thing that it does with John's system. It's fucking cool.
Yeah, it is really, really cool. And also the thing that and I wanted to double click on this a little bit too with you, that I think what John pointed or highlighted is important was a moment where I think there was being read a case study of a particular person, like a personality profile or tendencies, right?
Yeah.
And the situation. And then you were like, well, clearly this, that, and then the other thing, and you predicted the whole fucking thing, right? Put it into a bow, and then it started to go on, and John's like, wait a minute, what the hell was that? Right. And and so I think he was, if I remember right, I mean, a lot of this stuff is kind of blending in at this point in my mind, but if I remember right, what was he highlighting about that? Right.
Yeah.
And what was the through line that made that important? Right.
Right. Well, I think so. What you had there was Gary was presenting a case. It was amalgamation of, probably, but undoubtedly somebody who he had seen was presenting. I'll let the audience just know if you haven't seen the series. So, the case has got high conscientiousness and sort of high expectations to achieve, which comes with conscientiousness. Sort of a press on openness to explore, but also high neuroticism. And in a developmental stage where the kind of launching into adulthood was not taking root. Okay.
Right.
And then finding themselves in a place where you're feeling a bit pressed and trapped at the same time. Okay. And so Gary described sort of just basically the trait scenario and then the developmental scenario. And then John offered some reflections about from a recursive relevance realization, what kind of press and how you might want to think about that. And then I came in, and because this is what I do in part, gave I think what John would experience as a much wholer picture of the dynamics in relationship to, say, the way in which the egoic justification system would have beliefs about the self, about the world, the way the emotional system would grab a hold of that, the conflicts that would be the case, and then the way you get jammed in a particular developmental lifestyle to see the world and feel like there's an enormous potential that you're now frozen in that you can't realize, get incredibly frustrated, and then have that neurotic system take you off and blame self, blame other, avoid, control, but do so in a way that very vulnerably makes you vulnerable to greater and greater paralysis and will drive you into first anxiety and then shut you down in depression. And then all of a sudden you'll be like, oh my God, this is a fucking catastrophe.
Totally. It's so interesting because it's like, I'm now remembering why that struck me is one, is it so that sense of kind of just getting a little bit of information and be able to figure all of that stuff out is something I've been remarkably good at too, right? And haven't completely known why. I just thought, well, talked to a lot of people, read a lot of books, probably somewhere picked it up, right? But
no, it's because you have a gift, Guy.
Right.
Okay? Right. You're an empath, which means that you are able to drop into the psyche of another people, pick up core resonances, intuitively understand the basic structure, see how those resonances would play, and utilize relatively limited information to drop a picture of the psychic structure into the world, and then show your empathy of that. You have that very strong.
Yeah. Well, it's also this kind of, I think that the thing about that also highlighted was this thing I see over and over and over and over and over again. And it's this propensity that we have to get into double binds.
Totally.
Like, and I like double bind, by double binds, the Gregory Bateson kind of notion of it, of like, it's not a problem, right? Like a bind isn't a problem. It's like, if I go left, I'll lose my right leg. If I go right, I'll lose my left leg. Can now solve that problem. That's not a problem, right? And I think that Bateson thought that genius, what's normally called genius, has to do with your relationship to double bind somehow, right? That there's something about the genius that can find in his terminology, something like the difference that makes the difference, that affords you to leave the level of the bind. And when you leave the level of the bind, a new organization kind of happens that you can't even predict, right?
Yep.
And then I thought, and it's like, and I think most of the time double binds just turn into people's lives becoming grinds, right?
Yes.
They just like people just shut down. They just become less and less alive, right? It's a complete implosion or a certain kind of toleration of it, right? And I think that there's something about being human, first of all, probably. And this is where I'll hand it over to you, but something about this being able to relate to multiple levels of context at once and be able to move amongst those, but then also have this kind of emotional thrown like disposition towards certain kinds of survival and at different levels and in different ways. And then you just end up with this whole fucking knot.
Totally.
Right. It can be huge, right?
Totally. I mean, essentially here's the way I boiled it down. Okay. And I'm finding and get a lot of mileage out of this. Okay. So essentially what you get is the intersection of some developmental vulnerabilities, trauma, adverse childhood events. Okay. You don't need to have those, but that sets you up for vulnerability. Okay. You get a high trait neuroticism, which basically means your negative affect system fires off, stays up, difficult to soothe. Okay. Yeah. We'll have certain kinds of vulnerabilities. You get beliefs about the way you and the world ought to be. Okay. Yeah. And then a particular kind of relational conflict, text. Okay. Yeah. And essentially then you get negative situations triggering negative feelings. And then many different types of structures want to come in from a higher order, be aware of this system. And then what I call the ABCs now of the triple negative is avoid it. Oh God, get that up. Man, that can't happen. Blame self. I can't believe I caused that. Blame other. Okay. Yeah. Or try to then control it to say this is never going to happen again. Okay? Right. So now you're basic, and all those things make sense. I mean, it's a negative feeling, negative situation. You don't want to deal with it. Somebody's to blame, and you want to control it. Okay. Right. But the way we do it in the context of what we're really designed for relative to the societies we're in, all of that is very vulnerable in certain relationship and identity contexts to turn into water on a grease fire logic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where it's like,
totally.
actually, the way you're avoiding this, you really need to encounter the negative feeling and process it so you become whole, rather than taking this issue and jamming it in a closet and then being afraid of it. Now you have secondary fear of it. Now you didn't learn from the incident. Now you have to be afraid of everything that triggers it. So you're really vulnerable if you now engage in avoidance. Okay.
Yeah.
If you engage in blame self, you're going to diminish yourself and create character attributions that are problematic and make yourself weaker. All right. You blame other people, they're going to get defensive. You're going to be tense. They're going to be blaming you back. And now you're going to be in conflict that way. You know, and then often if you try to control it, well, that's the active water of the grease fire. No, this can't be. No, I shouldn't have feelings. No, this is going on. When in fact, you know, the leg already got cut off. You know, if we do,
yeah,
it's like actually the leg got cut off. You know, and you can't put it back on. You know, that's the situation you're in, and yeah, it fucking hurts.
Right.
But the system's like, no, I can't tolerate that. I can't lose fucking leg, so I have to control it. So that's what you see I'm going to block it. I'm going to blame. I'm going to control. And that makes the psyche so much more vulnerable.
Right. Lock to blame to control.
And then it just builds this fragile structure. It drives the system in to increasing double bind. I'm doing for folks that are not watching, I'm doing a little Chinese finger trap. Which is the classic double bind at a cone level. Cone. Right. And you're just sort of like, actually, the other task is to get meta on it, a metacognitive observer, right? Get meta on it, see a multiplicity of different perspectives, and learn a different way to be in relationship to the negative feeling, negative thought.
Right.
And calms, the calm MO things like, oh, hey, we can be curious, accepting, loving, motivated toward valued states of being. Circling is a relational context, for that, for building intimacy and growth and purpose in the real shit of when shit is real, and that's often negative. It's like, how do we actually hold that and be together with growth and purpose and reality and empathy?
Totally. Yeah, because oftentimes I see in circles double binds kind of get real. It's always this sense of like, there's nothing more freeing. It's the strangest. It's on one level, it's a big cognitive dissonance, but emotionally, it's not at all. Like when they see that they're in a double bind, there's something so relieving about that, right? Because it just explains, first of all, because I think at that moment, something meta opened up other than double bind. Everything else became possible, right? So that the feeling of elation. I've noticed this with a lot of, you could say, negative psychological insights about yourself. You can find out awful things. Like, I've turned the whole world into my mother and have been trying to fix her with all my relationships, right? It's like an awful contextual thing, right? But like the context of liberation that opens up, right, in seeing that, right? And double binds seem to have an extra oomph to that particular thing.
That's really interesting.
In circling, in particular.
Right.
Well,
it is totally the case that, we deal with this all the time. Like, if you come at somebody, well, you know that you're turning the world into your mother, and that's part of the reason you're suffering. People are just like, fuck you. They will resist the implications, the blame, if it's a context of that. If they come at it from the side, right? If they get sort of that meta perspective and somehow are in the mindset where they're seeing themselves as they've shifted the object-subject relation, and now they're looking at themselves, and now they have this curious hope that maybe there's a flexibility in perspective and they need insight, and then they see it, right? In that case, then it's the insight that, oh my God, this is true. And now the implication that I do this, that I'm a part of this, and then I can now see this from this different perspective. So it's one of the most fascinating questions is, what are the real dynamics of when is it liberating to learn this? And how do we create a context where it's liberating? And when is it devastating? And shame inducing and defensive, because you could go on that head on and people are like, fuck you.
Right.
Or, totally. Or it's not really a double bind, it's this. And it's like, fuck you, I can't do this and I can't do this. What are you saying? There'll be, the psychic defense system will be really activated, and they'll be doubling down on the reality that they face and why they have to do what they're doing. As opposed to what John and I were talking about, is different context creates a reciprocal opening of meta possibilities with flexibility and adaptation, and how to get that mindset in that second place as opposed to the first. That's a really great question.
Totally. It seems like I heard John what was it? I forget what his name was. Somebody who does something called Alethea coaching or something.
Yes. Right? I'm gonna blank on his name, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I like the language that he used, right? Where he was talking about working with a part, right? A part of you that becomes kind of solidified, right? And that you start, well, one, you just identified it as a part of you, and then you go into a poetic attunement with it, right? And it's this where you start to understand why it's there. You start to have empathy for it, and it makes sense. And what starts to happen is, as you go into attunement with it, it softens, right? So it's kind of, and then as it softens, you go into more of this kind of reciprocal, experiential. I like the way that he put it. It was like Grenlin, Eugene Grenlin's work, right? But he says what he called it was saying what you're feeling and feeling what you're saying cycles, right? Of this process of an emptying out of that structure starts to be a new presence starts to come in, right? New qualities. You can actually feel virtue start to come up, right? And stuff like that. But this idea of this softening part, right? Where something's hard and it softens, that part seems to be the thing that gets the whole thing moving, right?
Totally. Yeah. So here's the way I believe this is a really crucial thing, and I try to emphasize when we find people. I often use the word mode, a mode of your being, but part is very good too. Okay, and the idea is that basically you're a collection of modes and desires, okay, that are trying to solve certain kinds of problems in living. Okay, you have sexual desires trying to solve a certain kind, get laid. Okay. But there are other kinds of desires that are like, okay, manage standards and avoid this fear and watch your judgment of other people and things like that. Okay. And then they take on particular personas, because the way in which you learn them is you sort of internalize particular roles, and then they become a part that have this sort of investment, influence, justification structure. Okay.
Yeah.
But the way in which people live, and this is Eric Berne's transactional analysis, that turns the ego, superego id into a child and a parent, and critical parent, usually a vulnerable child, and a healthy adult. Okay, these are very common modes that people would have. And we can see the child, sort of an impulsive, feeling system that wants certain things, can get vulnerable. You get a critical parent, an internalized standard that's anticipating the judgment of the other. Just a very of the parts that I see, that lots of different variations can emerge. I do parts work explicitly. Sometimes I do internal family systems, but the most common mode conflict that I see is this Eric Berne version of an introject critic and a wounded child version. And so the critic is really pissed off. It's anticipating the judgments of others. Says, if you want to amount to anything, do this, that, and the other. Why the hell do you do this, that, and the other? And this is internalized battle of a critic and a child. And then you have this ego that's like kind of watching this. It's like, what is this? Okay. And why do I do this to myself? Or I just try to avoid it. That almost dissociates. And it really is this. So what I try to help the person do, the first thing is I try to help them do is get perspective. So I often will do like what I call the restaurant exercise. Okay. So the restaurant exercise is that you imagine yourself in one of those urban restaurants, where there's no space between the tables. Okay. And I put the healthy ego at one table. Okay. And then I put the critical parent and the child at the other. Okay. And you can't help but overhear. Okay?
Totally.
And then I said, play it out. you know? Okay.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so the child starts whining and is disruptive. And then the parent's like, what the hell are you doing? Get yourself together. Why can't you do this? And I say, all right, get into that, get that mode.
Yeah.
It's like doing,
Right. Right.
And then what I want to do is I want to then now you asked, one of the things is the hardening. Okay. So the hardening is found in the tensions between them. The child wants its thing. It wants either, validation, even as it does a shitty job, or it wants protection, or it wants freedom to do what it wants, or it can be also, irritable and impulsive and all that. And it wants all that fucking freedom. It's, more primitive animalistic gratification, more vulnerability. The parent, critical parent, wants you to get social influence. It wants you to live up to standards. It wants you to, it's internalize the moral judgment about what your value is. And it wants you to live up to those things. Okay.
Yeah.
And by definition, the parent child isn't, in some ways, at least is vulnerable to not. So now, what do you have? You have a tense rigidness of a child trying to do stuff and a parent trying to control it, and then pulling against each other hard. Right?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And now you're in a stuck situation where the kid's going to pull and the parent's going to pull back, and they're justifying each other in dialectic tension, pulling hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I would imagine if somebody comes into relation with them, that tension will be projected out into conflict with the other person, right?
Totally.
You see that all the time, right?
And even indeed the healthy ego is like, why are you guys doing this? And then they're like, fuck you, we're going to do our thing. And everybody, if you get stuck into it, then you just become another polar structure. Okay.
Yeah.
But if you enter into each one of their systems and help understand them, what they're trying to do, at least, okay, what do they want? The kid wants to be known and seen and valued in a particular way. Okay.
Yep.
What does the parent want? The parent wants the kid actually to be valued by other people.
Yeah. The meta outcome is good. Yeah.
It's like, okay, wait, you're doing this because you love your kid in some way.
Yeah.
You want to protect them from the harshness and truth of reality. Reality sucks, and people can be assholes, and they will judge your ass. And if you think you're going to be just get off by being vulnerable and whiny and impulsive, you're wrong. People will judge your ass. I am here to protect you. I'm here to tell you like it fucking is.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what that parent usually is doing. It's like, I'm here to tell you the truth, and I'm here to protect you. It's better if I hit you than the world hits you.
Yeah.
Metaphorically. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, so what you're doing is you're laying the truth out on the line. You're telling what the standards are, and you're trying to get that system to listen so that it's better down the road.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to do. So as if that parent starts to feel that it's being seen for what it's trying to do, you will feel it loosen.
Yeah.
Because it's like, yes, this is the spring tension. In Guy dynamic terms, is a spring tension that I'm trying to push down on, which is the standards of the world and the protection and the reality of the truth. And if you negate me and just say, well, you're being an abusive parent, stop being such an asshole, the parent says, fuck you, you don't understand. You will not understand, and you will miss my whole point of being.
Yeah.
But if you tell me what my point of being is and it resonates, then I'll be like, okay, now we at least start talking about what it is that I'm trying to represent. I can be seen at that level, and I can be like, my justification is going to be heard, and it can be held. And if you then enter it and empathize with it, it's like, yeah, that's what I'm after.
Totally.
Okay, that makes sense. Actually, you're not a bad person for being after that.
Right. So it's kind of like in this case, the parental role, right, or part is, and with people too, it's when you see their point and there's a sense of they get the sense of, because you saw their point, it must matter to you that what they care about.
Exactly. That you both know it, so you're not ignorant of it. You don't. If you don't understand me, you just try to eliminate me. That you see me as a good person. Almost essentially, the person system needs to be justified. Okay.
Yeah.
No one goes around saying everything I say is untrue and harmful. Nobody justifies their life as like, I lie and am harmful. That's what I call bad false
Totally,
justification.
exactly.
And you can't
Right.
do it. Actually, you cannot actually try it. You're like, this is
Yeah.
totally untrue and will hurt you. Believe, I'm supporting
Yeah.
this. And actually, you're like,
Yeah.
the whole system is like, so every justification system is either going to be grounded in a truth claim or a value claim or some mix. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's going to want to be then true and good at some level. Either, well,
Yeah.
I'm a piece of shit, but that's because the world's a piece of shit. And I'm here to tell you the truth. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Justified there. But,
Totally.
the system, if this is what the whole justice says, is that if you come at it and you don't speak it, you activate the psychological defense of the lockdown of the I don't need to listen to you, and I would be rejecting you just like an alien body, an alien foreign invader is rejected by the immune system of the body.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that sense of just that, how the way Heidegger talks about Dasein or human being is kind of like that. It's what makes the hyphens and being in the world is care. Right. Like it's hard to really get it. It's hard to even talk about a human being that doesn't presuppose just a fundamental sense of a care, right? That discloses the world in a particular way. And I've noticed that there's something about if you see that disclosure and you really want to know how it's occurring for them, that like it's almost like we know, it's almost like human beings know that can only show up for you as if you are at some level caring about my world, right? The fact that I'm attending to it is a caring about the world. The fact that like you're attending to what's important to me is caring about me. And that particular thing seems to open up or soften or make all this other stuff possible that's not possible. Because you're talking about that sense of like what makes the difference between laying it out all in front of you, right? And you going, right? Yep. Or you actually defending against the truth, right? Yes. Of it, right? Okay. That kind of sense of care seems to be just so fundamental. Okay. Right?
Yeah, I mean, and I would say that here's a couple of things that I'm coming up as you say that. So one of the things, I built a behavioral investment theory before I knew anything about Heidegger. Okay, I was not well versed in philosophy, quite frankly. Okay, embarrassingly so, actually. Now better. Okay, I'm better now, Guy. So what behavioral investment theory says is actually we should think about the structure of the nervous system, yes, as an information processing system, but to do what? As an investment value system. Okay?
An
investment value system for the animal to contact the environment and orient its vector of attention. Okay. And distribute work effort as a function of value.
Right.
Now, if you want to summarize that in one word, care is a pretty good word to summarize that. So when I heard Heidegger framing being in the world in relationship to that one word, care, which he's of course coming at from a philosophical, ontological, embodiment kind of perspective in the phenomenological tradition, it's really fascinating. I'm coming this evolutionary phylogenetic, attending as a clinical psychologist to the psychic phenomenology, but also grounded in this sort of
very
functional
similar places.
Like, So at a theory level, there's this issue of care, and then at a relationship influence level, this whole issue came to me in terms of, oh my God, we have to be wary whether people are manipulating us in social influence, like instrumentally, or whether they care about us in terms of relational value. They care about our essence.
And how goes is the process of you call it person making, right? That's how we become persons.
Well, there's a couple issues there in terms of our network into the relational field. We're tracking. We do this as unique primates that can track others. Okay, this is Tomasello's work, and I can internalize you and internalize me, and we immediately know how to participate with each other. Okay, and this sets the stage for us to become persons. because it creates an implicit intersubjective field between us that I think is much richer than even chimpanzees and bonobos have. Okay, Tomasello's work suggests this. So I can internalize you, track you, and create an implicit intersubjective field. I sometimes call this mind 2B, where mind 2 is my subjective field, which is not really directly accessible. But when you and I know each other and you are able to track my eyes and you know me personally, you really get a sense that you know that what's behind the eyes, and there's enough iterative process that it's like, okay, I know you in relationship to me, and we dance together, and there really is this sense of intersubjective field. The intersubjective psychoanalytic people like Stollerall will dialogue about this a lot in terms of the felt, created, transference, countertransference, iterative process. Okay, so what that means is there's a core animal investment of care. Then there's this primate dynamic, and then to a hominid dynamic about the relational implicit structure of care. Okay.
Yeah.
And then the question is, are you manipulating me for your own gain? That's social influence. Or do you have relational value for me? Okay. Yeah. Meaning that you actually, well, I am you've internalized my well-being as part of your well-being.
Okay? Yeah.
And then you care. If you have empathy and alignment with me, then that will be a signal, okay, that I can basically reciprocate and let you in to the system.
Totally.
All right.
Totally.
Because then you will be an ally, and our interest will be your interest will be my interest, and you may help me see the world a particular way. If, on the other hand, you have your own perspective and you basically just want me to shut the hell up and go away, or take my shit, right? Or just, in other words, bullshit me and get me to sell you something, or you sell me something. Well, then you're influencing me, but you don't care.
Yeah. Right? But so you can start to get where betrayal is like almost everything to
unbelievably central, right? To what this betrayal means. You've let it into the system, and then it did something that you then relied on, and then it obliterated when you're like, oh my God, I should have been defended against it. And now I don't know everywhere. I'm infected anywhere, right?
Yeah.
My defense system of what cares inside of you now is obliterated. And now is it now I love this other person like I love them? Are they going to betray me? I mean, now when you get betrayed like that, the entire structure.
Then your own personhood comes into question. Right. Your own thoughts about what the truth is or isn't.
Oh my God,
comes into question.
The entire structure can be, total chaos inducing, bitterness, and then cognitively chaotic in terms of what's justifiable and what does this mean and how do I sense make.
Right. Yeah, it was Adi Da. Adi Da said he was a nut, or he was completely enlightened and
I know Wilbur loved him, and I know my friend Andre Marquis told me a lot about him. He followed him for a while, so I got a sense of who this character was. But I was not a big. I never was deeply involved with him. But anyway, yes.
Yeah, totally. Neither was I. But I had some friends that gave me some talks he gave. But he says this interesting thing about. He says the self-contraction arises out of the mood of betrayal. Right?
Nice. Yep.
He has some interesting language, like the self-contraction, right? Yep. Where the contraction and the self are mutually reciprocal, right? And that all contraction arises out of the mood of betrayal. And you can kind of get it, when you break it down more specifically, like what you do here, right? Because if I can't trust you, but then I can't trust the thinking that trusted you, right? Then anything that I look at is suspect, right? So now I can't trust me, and I can't trust my thinking, right? And that keeps going. It seems like the only thing I have is to tighten, right? I just get the sense of just pucker.
Yep, totally.
Right? And start fights maybe.
Right.
As hard as you can, just push, right?
Yeah. Totally. Totally.
A whole self could arise out of that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's so congruent, metaphorically at least, and I think really functionally as well. But with what we were talking about in the psychopathology thing, certainly John's fundamental emphasis was the dynamic iterative process of reciprocal realization, recursive realization that would either narrow you into a constricted, ever tightening field of insistence that much of which is trapped by double bind, trapped by a particular emphasis. I'm betrayed, and then I have to do this, and I have to do this, and the solutions just box you further and further in to a particular loop function that's then increasingly constricted around that tightness, which basically the process itself then condemns you to stay there. Almost no matter what's now happening, you're basically locked in. So the environment can change, but you're going to be very vulnerable to not being able to see that in relation. And you certainly then can't take whatever it was that started this and get yourself meta out of it when you're trapped in that type of constriction.
Right. Totally.
So, and the idea then that betrayal would be one of the kinds of infections, or potentially a thematic central infection that would lead to that, is a really interesting. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I can totally see at a thematic level, because then it's a betrayal of myself, of and other in the world. And then once you're, the fundamental assumptions. Actually, I remember my mentor Beck, okay, who could be really loving, but could be an asshole, and God rest in peace. Okay, but one of the things that when he got pissed at me, he would jump and basically be like, Gregg, you made an assumption. You know what assumptions do? They make an ass of you and me. Right. And then, you're like, okay, I was like, you hang up the phone, and because I'm pretty analytic, I'll sort of basically be like, okay, so what you're telling me, my sort of metabolized rage goes into like, so what you're telling me is you and I can't make assumptions about the world. Okay. Do you know that actually, if you take that on face value, we're actually completely paralyzed about the world? I assume that a plane is not going to come through here. If it did, I would want to be running in the building. So should I run from the building or not? Because I assume that there's no plane coming through the window. If I were actually question every assumption that I made in relationship to the world, I would be completely paralyzed. I would have lost all trust in anything. And so that's reminding me of that at a number of levels. It's reminding me of sort of both he had the bodily impact of actually creating an enormous amount of anxiety in me. And the intellectual piece was like, what that comment does? It basically undermines me and makes me vulnerable across the entire structure of being, because you can always bring that up anytime something goes wrong. Of course, you've made assumptions because you're always making assumptions.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Oh, yeah.
It's really cool.
That's where it becomes tricky to have an analytical mind, right? It becomes tricky, right? That it's interesting. The thing I've noticed, I think, both from just being in multiple dimensions of hell over and over again throughout my life myself, and watching people being in that kind of hell, of that having just had a betrayal and that deep breaking of internal trust, essentially, through that thing, it's still, I guess it's the same thing. It's like the same thing we were just talking about, is like, well, because by one definition, there's no way out of that, right? It's just this thing. But if that can be articulated and spoken back and said, right, it becomes obvious that that is a painful thing, and it should be a painful thing, and that they're feeling that pain about this, and they can trust that, right? It's like, it's that thing. And that's one of the things I've noticed, where I just, in so many times, I started realizing, like, I'm in a place where this is the constant recognition of the most awful thing, and there's nothing I can do about it. In fact, knowing about it is just an exhibition of forever being in an awful situation thing, right?
Right.
And the thing that it's like the through line that I was able to take solace in is that it was painful, right, was right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And like that it was painful meant that there was something not like that. Pain was indication. It was a connection to reality. And then it could kind of bootstrap itself up again, right? And
that is such, I mean, that's essentially the triple negative neurotic loop insight too. I mean, it's exactly that insight. It's sort of like negative situation, negative feeling, then is right. The negative feeling is right.
Yeah.
Not to be avoided, blamed, or controlled about. It's to be validated. It's just to be sat in. It's just to be seen.
Totally.
Okay? Which I really want, I've said this a number of times, but I really want everyone to listen to what Guy said. I mean, and I've said it in my own case, but you just said it brilliantly in your own way. And now think about what that means about the way we medicalize depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
It means you shouldn't be feeling this negative feeling. There's something wrong with you for feeling it. You have a disease or disorder. You need to have a negative reaction to your negative feelings, you know? And I'll admit it's complicated and there's a network, but damn, do we absolutely need to know how to align our negative feelings to negative situations and do exactly what you said, which is to ground ourselves in the reality of that relation and not be in denial about it, but actually have the capacity to accept it and be present with it and own it, and then work from there, from that truth.
Yes. And in that sense, it's like I'm thinking about this. I guess what you're talking about, like when you go, it's because a lot of the trust that's broken in betrayal, in this example that we're using, is like ends up being a self-betrayal because I can no longer trust my judgment of the right. And that if that goes in there deeper, right, then everything starts to be undermined, right? And that is hell, and it feels bad, right? That feeling bad, right, is in some sense animating its intelligibility, right? That there's a structural functional whole. And if you can identify it, you're also implicitly opening up to everything else, right?
Yes.
If you can feel bad about this situation, that badness you can trust, right? And if you can trust that, you can start to rebuild and catch it again, right? And, build back up. There's something about that. There's a solace. There's a certain kind of dignity in pain.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I'm thinking about my own. So as many people know, in 2019 in November, I encountered a clash with my program. And that clash with my program was a classic, I experienced as a classic betrayal in a particular kind of way. And I'm thinking about applying this in relationship to what I went through, because certainly it fits in the sense that there was a constricting and a narrowing and a chasing around a particular circle. And this is even when I got a ComMemo flashlight available. And I did try to do that, but there was definitely, this hit me in myself, and it created a cascade in a particular way that was, and I'm trying to think about, okay, and I tried to do this, and this was really interesting. And I certainly came out of it and got reconsolidated, but I still also feel vulnerable. If Poseidon fucks me around again, I'm sure I'm capable of doing back into this. Hell can find you.
Right.
At least certainly me, I feel pretty robust, but if the wrong set of events happens, I'll be tossed and be very at the mercy of life very quickly.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out so what happens is negative things happen, you feel negative, and you start to, for me, it was the implication of all of this. So part of what was going on was then the negative feeling does drive a desire to avoid, to blame, to control. Okay, if we apply that. And then the real wisdom trick is to sort of like, okay, how do I maintain the negative feeling, negative situation, honor that, okay? And when it's serious, and mine was not catastrophically serious, but it was intense and it had a lot of meaning. To try to hold that without basically being like, I need to write this. I need to prevent more catastrophe. This needs to be contained. This is unjust. There's wrong things going on. you know?
Yeah.
And this has bigger implications. One of the things that I really struggled with in retrospect, in terms of kind of going crazy, was, and I still to this day is a tricky thing, although I'm super glad the way it worked out. But part of what happened to me was that I saw this as a fractal. Okay. The fractal was what was happening to me was happening to, frankly, white men of a certain kind in the academy. And I noticed, you know, that the knives were coming out in a particular context, and the rules had changed. And because of the history, basically it was like, yeah, we're done with any, you know, sort of like, you know, we're not really going to think about the spirit of this. If somebody complains, you're a problem. You know, that's basically the structure.
Yeah.
And then I was primed to be in a way that's no one would be that way, and I can be myself. And I'm like, no, you know. And then what happened was, it was like, for me, what happened was, then it was like, oh my God, if I don't fight back against this, okay, if I don't do something, okay, to, you know, make this, I will be complicit, and my little fractal will be a bad part of the bad scenario. So one of the things that made me crazy was, a part of me was trying to jack it up to be the one that would bring attention to it. It's like, okay, this is people should see this. You know, I'm gonna make this an issue. And I do think this is one of the things I see this in when people get really depressed. It's like, you know, no, I'm gonna feel shitty, and then I'm gonna act shitty to honor this shittiness, or I'm gonna do this as a way to embody it and say fuck you to the world because I need to do this. And it is figuring out what that is and how to hold that, I think, is a really, you know, clinically, I struggle with that all the time. I want to give honor to that. And I'm also like, well, you do that down the road. Just like if I had done it and blown it up in a certain way, my system would have been much less healthy down the road. So it's a fascinating, you know, sort of like, okay, well, definitely hold the negative situation, negative feeling relation. When it's fairly intense, it will hit you and then it will spread. And I was just thinking, for me, hell was like, it was a double bind. It's like, if I don't do this, I don't give myself integrity. I don't speak to larger issues. If I do, I blow up a lot of shit I value. It's like, oh my God. And if I do nothing, I feel empty or confused or silenced. It was a really interesting thing.
Yeah, totally. And what happened? What did you end up doing? And how did you float out of that without being completely excluded, ostracized, with no self and no justification?
Right. I mean, without getting too many details, there was a series of events that happened so that I decided that I was a boxed in loser no matter what I did, meaning that I couldn't, that there would, if I were to I was debating whether to sort of try to pull a blow up thing for good. And there was a series of events that happened that basically got me convinced that that option would just blow me up. And although it might get some, you know, little attention, it would just be a blow up, and it wouldn't be part of a fractal thing that was healthy at all. Okay.
Yeah.
That helped consolidate my organized structure of strategy. And then I allowed myself to go into a, you know, neutered cave, basically, you know?
Yeah.
And then I think I basically licked my wounds as a neutered animal and was like, okay, I'll come to terms. This is the path, and I will build from this path. I will sit with my wounds, you know, and honor the wounds that they are.
Like you did it.
Yeah. And then
it sounds like you did just that on some level.
And then I will reconsolidate my identity where it was dependent upon this kind of structure. I'm going to reshift my identity so that this is a past dependency, and I will reconsolidate on a different kind of ground. And thankfully, in terms of, if we go to the betrayal, I have not had too many betrayals in my life. I've had a few. Right? But I have a pretty foundational attachment system. I have a lot of network. I've got pretty skilled in many domains, and I've got a lot of connections. So I'm super fortunate to have a network. I, of course, work with a lot of people who are completely isolated, very dependent on one system, and then that implodes, and then there isn't a backup system where you can then, okay, I'll reconsolidate, step into some resource and reboot because I have both the capacities and the social supports to do so. Instead, you lack capacity and support, and then you wallow in the land of personality disorder and despair.
Right.
And that's pretty brutal.
Right.
But so, yeah, I reset and then was able to reconsolidate, shift the ground in which I'm now fertilizing rooting myself, and thankfully have found, in fact, the whole meta-modern world is really, the meta-modern world is really my people now, where it was the CI program before, you know,
Yeah.
it was just sort of, okay, my identity now is, oh, I'm really attached to whatever this is. Meta-modern is just really a placeholder for it as far as I'm concerned.
Totally. Well, that's just a lesson just in terms of so many, so many things about what you just described and all of that. And so it does sound like to me that when you said, well, when you realized that you had to basically, that there was no way out of this, right?
Yeah. And that's what I literally said. I said, I'm in a cage. I'm in a cage, and it's locked. You're in a cage and it's locked, and you can grab a hold of the bars at this juncture and burn your hands because they're heated bars, you know.
Yeah.
And you could shake, but you're in a basement in a cage, so you're nowhere to go.
Totally.
In this context.
And so you took the cave and you made it a licking spot, right?
Right.
And like went into that, right? And recalibrated things, right? In such a way that, I mean, arguably, like you're in a better spot than you were, like
definitely
in the beginning, right?
Definitely, yeah.
That's what's fascinating to me.
And again, it's really, well, you know, if you have a pretty rich portfolio, the nice thing about you get to be resilient and robust when you have a rich portfolio. Okay, so it's sort of, if you want to use a stock analogy, one of my super important stocks crashed. And I wanted to save it, and I thought it was totally unfair, and I can't believe this happened. And I got to a place where but thankfully it's like, but that's just a stock. That's not my entire portfolio, you know. And that's where I was lucky, where I could be, if I was really a person in a cage, as my entire body's in a cage, like in medieval Europe, and that's all I am. You know, I don't know that I get salvation. You know, here it's a symbolic cage where I actually have all sorts of freedom and good food, and I can get drunk and get, you know, do what I need. So I mean, you know, it's not like I'm some monk. You know, it's like it is the case that I was able, but a lot of people do have trouble when they get, you know, egoic injuries and pride, reputation injury, and challenge about things people you trust, and you know, it drives a lot of people into real, you know, real misery. And it drove me into misery for a while, but I definitely was able to put a basement. I definitely consolidated. I definitely licked my wounds, and I definitely then shifted my portfolio, and grew from it. I also made a commitment. I said, listen, this was a combination, and I certainly have my justification of blame externally, but I look at myself and I didn't do what I wanted to do. And then I asked myself, I said, you know, what are the kind of virtues you're weak on, and did they contribute? Okay. And I'm weak on humility. You know, I carry a particular, I mean, I think I developed a unified theory of knowledge. I think I actually see the world better than other people, almost bar none. It's that kind of edge. And that I'm living that in a particular way that actually deserves more accolades than it is given. And now people are giving me this. And it's like, you know, I'm bringing my edge to that, and I'm not doing it empathetically, and I'm doing it modestly and with my little adolescent ego, even though I try to, you know, say I'm all wise, but I'm still carrying this, you know, immodest adolescent ego. And I knew that about myself. And then I could see in this context, hey, you live that, and that was part of the fire. Your edge was part of the fire. You know? Let's smooth that off, you know. And look, you think you're all that. Look what happened to you. You didn't think you know. So it was a humbling experience. And then I knew that humility was something. So you know, I looked at the elephant sun god and said, all right, you know, Poseidon and the elephant sun gods, you guys are bigger than I am. You know, I'm just a person, and I'll you know, that's what I am. Anything other than a person. And I'm certainly no Superman. So there it is. And I can lesson learned. And and like I said, you know, next time I happen, I'll go right down into this. Like, okay, I'm beaten. You know, the world's bigger than I am, and I know that. So I carry humility, perhaps in a way, and I think that was one of the pieces that did allow me to, you know, grow into an aspect of virtue. That's how I framed it, at least.
Totally. And you're saying too. I appreciate your acknowledging too. It's like, you have a network of relations around you that you've built up over the years, right? And that is, see, it's really interesting to think about this, Gregg, right? Of where, if you're, human life has got at least a few of those are going to come just by virtue of being alive, right? But like, that network of relations is the difference that makes that difference between what kind of prison that was, right?
Oh, God.
In some sense, right?
Totally.
That is, it's so funny because I'm now that I'm fathering again an infant, right. I'm so much more struck by like that almost the whole job is really to afford him to have whatever he needs such that he can network in that kind of way, right? How to be liked, socialized, right? Like to be kind, compassionate, like funny, socially coordinated, right? While honoring his own constitution, all that kind of stuff, right? It's that network, because if you don't have that network, right? And it seems really easy to not have that network.
Well, we know,
right?
It's a beautiful insight really for a very empathetic father.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, totally. I know that's been a hell of a, in terms of your own life, I just imagine, given how your level of empathy and your maturity, what is it like to bring a life into the world, given where you are in life? It's been really
fucking wondrous. It's really wondrous a lot. Like, I mean, I'm 50, so I don't have as much energy as I did when in my 30s, but so it's, there's definitely moments where I'm like, Jesus, this is a lot of fucking work, right?
Dude, I'll confess online, I got snipped, so.
Yeah.
I'm like, there it is. I can empathize. I'm 51.
Like, I know you just fucking peed in your goddamn diaper. I think you could survive 3 more of those. I'm not fucking moving from the couch. I'm too old for this. Keep that fucking right. Right. So there's that part. But like, there's also this sense, this visceral sense, when I'm tracking it a lot more, because it's more distinct for me, of how and I think this links to this network of relations, how by the time he says I, right, what he references when he says I,
yes,
right, is going to be almost completely given by, or at least fully articulated into being by, these relations.
Exactly.
All the way through, right?
Totally.
And depending on how that went, the way he references this and what he finds will make probably a big difference.
Totally.
Just really appreciating kind of like how intersubjectively relational we are, like all the way down. Like, and that's to kind of get the sense of how much of that he just swims in, right? And then imagining him saying I, right? Yep. Now he's only got 3 words, which even that, those 3 words that he has, he's got mama, dada, and peanut butter.
Huh. Oh, yeah. That's an interesting theory.
No, mama, dada, and not peanut butter. That's what I put, banana. I put peanut butter on my bananas, right? But like, you can't quite even tell where that word started, right? Like, did it start because Brienne heard mama before I ever heard mama, right? Like, I'm like, I heard a babble, and she'd be like, did you hear that? Right? And then was it her hearing that and responding? And then he just started mimicking that, and that's it. And then I was like, then I would start hearing it. And then it seemed like even like these word accusations were these intense slowing down and going back and forth that happen in this transjective kind of space. And just to see that we're at this most cellular level all the way down is just stunning, right?
This is the hominid so self-other influence matrix.
Yeah. 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 The hominid
self-other influence matrix.
Yes. Yes.
Which
and by
is
hominid, what is it? What are you emphasizing by hominid?
I'm emphasizing organism to animal to mammal to primate to our particular primate lineage.
Okay, got it.
Okay.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah,
because
yeah.
we have, this is Michael Tomasello's work, okay, which I often reference, we have a capacity for implicit intersubjective we spacing. We space, okay?
Yeah.
Which is shared attention and intention.
Yeah.
Right? I can read where your attention is and what it wants, and I can sync up with it.
Yeah.
Right? And then that creates a shared investment care, but also now we need to navigate influence, meaning I can influence you and you can influence me. And how are we going to do that? Cooperatively, competitively, what level of analysis? And then that's what mapped by the influence matrix, the fourth dimension. It's like, oh, it's an entire field of internal working models of self and other, pre-verbal. Okay. That sits in a particular field of dance, participatory dance in the relational world. And it's out of that the person grows. This is where the person grows. Okay. The I justifier is going to pull itself out of the influence matrix field.
Right. Totally. And it's so interesting because you think about, on some level, and I've noticed this a few times, like when he when he goes through some growth spurt and he has some capacity and he throws himself off the couch, right, or something, and like he has a break with reality, he freaks out. Where he looks is right into our eyes.
Totally.
Right? Until he gets self-regulated. He just knows. And that's stunning to think about that, right? Where he is in this. That's when he loses reality, he goes right in. He's been like this since I first saw this when he was like 3-4 months old, I think.
Totally. That's when our record comes online. Yep.
So there's just this knowing about that in his being that's so oriented to that, right? Totally. That's just crazy fascinating when you think about this. But then you just kind of like to think about it in terms of, so essentially, and because our dependent nature, I mean, we're the most useless dependent things as infants by far, right? By fucking
for a
far.
long ass time.
Yeah, totally. So like that second womb is this intersubjective hominid thing that you just kind of talked about, right? And then by the time like you start to individuate and you're able to have a stable sense of self and you say that I is going to be on some, like, spoken poetically but also technically, is like that I is the beloved, right? And so then growing up, right, like apparently, like when you grow up, and this is what Chris Master Petro said when I was talking about this with him, it's like, and traditionally you grow up, right, and in that the beloved is supposed to move out from the parents and onto God, right?
Yep.
And then that relationship onto God is then you become the lover, and then you have a kid, right? Yep. And this whole thing goes on.
Yep. Right.
I don't know what that says about now, where it goes. Right?
Totally. Well, right. And so that's the traditional model. And then you get the oral indigenous model, where you're basically born into, at least the network hunter-gatherer community generally is a community of love itself. So historically, you really get born into the love of the tribe, as it were, and really an animistic love of spirit. If you look at many of the wisdom traditions in industrial systems. So, and then that got consolidated, civilization got abstract, and God ends up, taking a particular kind of role because civilizations have to justify at higher orders of abstraction, but they still afford a particular kind of legitimizing network of care, across a particular stack that has intergenerational health and rejuvenation potential. Okay, now they got all sorts of problems, but it's got intergenerational health and rejuvenation. I think that the modernity structure, with, as Nietzsche's like, you know, you guys killed God and you don't know what you've done.
Yeah.
And really then reductive mechanical explanations for the world becoming dominant. Well, you're really just a bunch of chemicals, right? And then instrumental capitalism, where we shift from relational value to basically who can acquire money, which is a symbol of instrumental influence. You know, money's interchangeable. You have money, I have money. There's no relational value. It's just fucking social influence. Okay.
Yep.
There's all of those things take the fundamental, what's supposed to be the embodied network of care at its core, independent of the sort of like what you can do, but how you can be, and then create a relational being structure. And we're obliterating that in a particular way, and doing it with a lot of danger. And I think that the fundamental structure of anxiety and the meaning crisis and the mental health crisis and the explosion of mental health problems in youth, okay, which we can document, explosion of mental health problems in youth is really tied to these kinds of analyses and can be really seen very clearly through them.
Right. Totally. And you're just, we can take a second, like maybe the rest of the time we can talk about this. I'm curious about what your sense of how to respond to that situation. Like what is your sense of what needs to happen? How do you think it can happen, if you think it could happen?
Right. Well, it's the hyper object that is reality is so unbelievably complicated that, I have notions, but first let me lead with humility.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
I learned a lesson or two.
Yeah,
it's way more complicated than my.
Viper.
It's way more complicated than my. I'm reasonably good at certain systemic analyses, and the systems 10 more times more complicated than my ability to track it. I do have diagnosed a problem. We're in a massive problem. We're in a chaotic, fragmented pluralism. Things are changing tremendously. It's outside of our hominid structure. Our justification systems are exploding. Our technologies are exploding, alienating us, things spiraling. So that is certainly my diagnosis. I believe we know that. Okay.
Yeah.
We're also innovating unbelievably fast. So that gives us all sorts of different potential and opening up all sorts of potentials. And people are seeing it, and people have the capacity to make adjustments and self-centered. That's good. And my optimistic side sees the sprouting of a new consciousness and a new potential that I think could be, and I see UTOK as being a really central, and even humility-wise, I think I could say with a fair degree of confidence, I think I pulled a particular thread that relates to the problems we'd have, that if we could insert it into the operating system, you'd solve a fuck ton of problems, Because the knowledge about human and knowledge about science and the knowledge about what we need to be grounded across the wisdom stack of energy, matter, life, mind, culture, oriented towards transcendental, being and wisdom. The UTOK gives you a really clear, no, this is where traditional science gets it right. This is where it gets it wrong. This is how you make holistic sense. This is how you revitalize the soul and spirit in the 21st century from a naturalistic framework, irrespective of, sure, maybe there's whatever's on the outside of this, but we know we get it wrong. And we know UTOK says we know we can fix it. Yeah. And if you fix it, you create a context of much more context of love and wisdom than, competition and economic growth that actually eats the planet and sets us up for all sorts of danger. There's a part of me that's like, oh my God, I think there's innovation. I think there's unbelievable goodwill. I think people are waking up to it. I think that there's real potential. I think I have a thread. I think it can weave together with the practices of circling and John's vision and, all the meta modern sensibility stuff. And it's really exciting. And then, there's also, we're fleas on a fucking Titanic. What the hell? Who am I kidding? It's a fucking Zoom conversation. When you look at the actual institutional inertia and the powers that be, the Putin and Biden are pulling triggers, and they're pulling triggers underneath algorithms that are pulling triggers that have, and that system is on its own course in a way that I don't understand. I have no idea how to actually change it, and whatever momentum it is where we end up. And it may, there isn't really any way to change that. So my answer is that my pessimism and optimism affords me to see out here the hyper object, project myself on it, use my analytic mind to narrate. I feel like I can see both of those, not know either. And then what it tells me to do is understand your use the metaphor of a garden as a fractal. Okay. Meaning it's like, I really think the garden if you could adopt it large scale, I will do what I can to participate in some sort of element, knowing that there's massive limits to what I can do and control as one person. And at the same time, it is the case that the proximal zone of my energy investment, okay, can create gardens in my world. And therefore I will, it does matter if I'm curious, accepting, loving, motivated, if I learn from humility, if I do connect with people, my garden and the people around me, you know, are different. That's what I will try to do. Lean realistically towards the positive with an eye on the pessimism that's also realistic, and try to then embody within the local what would be a fractal representation. So that's what I try to do at a more developmental level. If we have till 2050, my fantasy of influence is basically this: network the seers into a tapestry of understanding. That's this decade. Okay. So the seers are people that are meta-modern, whatever. The people are like, okay, we know this thing is broken, and we have ideas about Earth, we have ideas about technology, we have ideas about humanity, we have ideas about science, and there's ways to network them together to get a coherent, integrated pluralism and clarity about how we could actually sustainably live. So you get a map that upgrades the fragmentation from the Enlightenment gap and the chaotic fragmented pluralism between modernity and postmodernity into a coherent, integrated pluralism of the intelligentsia that actually gets clear enough about what that is so it can distribute a broadcast frequency. Right? Then the next decade is that broadcast frequency gets metabolized, and I don't mean this pejoratively, by intelligent lay people. Okay, so you got seers, and then you get intelligent lay people, and you have to, people have always with UTOK, like, make it so they can understand. It's like, I understand this super well. It's like, no, we're not talking about you. We're talking
translators.
About translate. It's like, okay, that's right. Translate. So then it gets translated, and then it gets metabolized in the 30s to 40s. Okay. And then the 30s to 40s metabolizers start having kids and start going into schools. And then they train the next generation. And then the next generation grows up with it. And if they grow up with it, then you can spread that through. And then that, like God, as Christopher mentioned, is a love potential, at least the way it's structured, that then creates a cumulative generative structure across the generations. And we become good ancestors, so that the back half of the 21st century is on a totally different trajectory.
Wow. Yeah. Great. I love that you just thought out this multiple generationally. That's really, really great. I mean, there's so many things that you just said right in there. But it's funny. I've had this thought a number of times, like, so I've had the opportunity to circle a few, like, kind of, you can for all intents and purposes enlighten people, right? Like people who have, in some serious way, you could just tell they cut the self cord in that sense, right? And they kind of like, one of the things that they're contending with is, how do they relate to that, especially now that they're not that which they were, right? And how do they deal with these kinds of thoughts that are on some level are so grand, right? Like, how do they do it? Like, and I just remember going on a ride with one of them where it was just like, well, trying to figure out what it must have been like for Jesus to realize he was Jesus, right? Like,
hey, what would I do? Hey,
like, totally. Like, first of all, how the fuck would you even relate to that knowing, right? How could you even begin to relate to that fucking knowing, right? Like, and how do you go about doing that? And it was so interesting because it had some parallels for him, given the kind of grand, unified kind of thoughts he was having, right? How does he relate to that? And we just went through that walk with Jesus. I remember what it wasn't the kind of conversation like was circling where it's some big conclusion, but it felt like we got closer to something, right? So I'm appreciating what you're talking about what it must have been it's taken for you to deal with the scope of your ideas, right? And how to relate to that, and how to appropriately relate to that, and like, like, you know, these lessons in humility and the fact that like you being recognized in a way in your lifetime, right? Get like letting that go or whatever the fuck that is, right?
No, it's totally, yeah, it's exactly right.
But this multi-generational thing is interesting. I want to send you I'll send you a lecture series that I think you would really dig. It's a Heideggerian guy out of Berkeley. He's dead now. What's his name? Herbert Dreyfus, where he did a series of lectures, and he did this one's on John the Baptist, right? Where he does these different, he identifies different moments where the epoch of intelligibility changed, right? And then he looks at like, what was that change? Who did it? How did it happen? How did it spread? How did it take? And he goes through and identifies that there's certain roles that always happen in all these things. There's the, there's the one who says it, right? Then there's the one who interpret it, right? There's always the one who then retranslates it, right? But it's so many iterations.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
So if you look at the Bible, right, and you look at that as a translation, you have all these conflicting stories. But on another level, you have this very broad way in which it can transmit. And if you look at like if anything fucking transmitted throughout the world as an example of something, it's Christianity, right?
Totally. Yep.
Yeah.
Totally. Love that. Yes, please do. And I know I've heard, I haven't followed Dreyfus. I know of him in cognitive science. I know how influential he is in John's thinking. I would really, and to connect that with his analysis with that and to relate to that, because yes, ever since 1997, and I'm stoned and the tree of knowledge falls out of me, my journey has been odd. You know, it's definitely been a transformative journey about like, okay, what is this? And, you know, who's crazy here? You know, it's like, am I crazy? Because I think this is unbelievably important. Or I mean, is everyone else crazy or am I crazy? I mean, we definitely have that very strong feeling. And then there's this felt sense of, okay, yes, and definitely my internalization of, all right, I'll come to terms with being ahead of its time. That's the very strong, I mean, that's where you get the whole arc of like, oh, there's a generational dynamic here. This is really a back half of the 21st century idea after a meta-modern sensibility has emerged and solidified, and people then are ready to actually be, you know, positioned to intelligibly open themselves to the transcending of the Enlightenment problems and actually upgrade their fundamental ontology of an energy information field that actually can then be tied together so that the various branches of knowledge are in coherent integrated network rather than, you know, this broken dispersed structure. And then you're like, well, that's true. And then you actually have a tree of knowledge into garden that actually does that. Then you would actually have an entire educational system, especially if it's one that ties together things like the coin that affords the subjective qualitative of being of each human identity, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, well, of course we would want that, but can you do that? It's like, actually, yeah. Turns out you can. You know, it's like, believe it or not, that's really cool. The answer is yes. And it will have implications, actually. You know? So that's what the hope is. But this generation, not so much.
Totally.
Maybe your kid.
Exactly.
They grow up in a different context. They're like, yeah. I mean, it feels like my kids are like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's like, okay, you know, but but everyone else thinks you're crazy, Dad. So all right, well.
I'll send it's on you. It's a YouTube series. I'll fund the link and send it to you. Yeah, for sure. I think you'll like it. I'm just curious too for you to get into some of Heidegger's work and just to see where that ends up in your.
I'd love that. I really would. I really welcome that because that's an area of blind spot. I mean, just embarrassingly enough, the entire phenomenological tradition is underdeveloped in my own thinking. Although obviously I'm a clinical psychologist, so I sit. But my recent work on the psyche has been really valuable and it stems its connection to the coin. I'm in a position now to build a psyche science relation that has not been built before. And and I'd love then to sit in the philosophical tradition of the phenomenologist and Heidegger.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, yeah, totally. Like, love to talk with you more about that. Yeah, yeah, love that. Love that. Great. Hey, it's been really good talking
Hey
with you.
man, you know, you warm my heart every time, Guy. It's just
Yeah,
talk
me
about
too.
nourishment. So I often sometimes talk about psychological malnourishment. Well, there's also psychological nourishment. When I clack
Yeah.
on and see Guy's face, I know nourishment is coming, and
Yay.
that's exactly what it is that happened again. And like I said, I've been, you know, long overdue for this, you coming to this community, but I so appreciate being part of my heart and my community, and the thread and the circling thread that gives me hope for the next generation. You are definitely top on that list. So I appreciate that, friend.
Oh, thank you, my friend. Mwah.
All right.
Yay.
We'll be in touch.
Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.
Okay, bye.